In this video, we're going to discuss the moral problem of drugs. The first argument we're going to discuss is the harm to others argument. The argument goes, if an activity ordinarily imposes serious and wrongful harm on others, then it is rightfully outlawed. Drug use ordinarily imposes wrongful harm on others. Therefore, drug use is rightfully outlawed. This argument is against drug use on the basis of harm. But what might be a counter to the harm to others argument? The first counter is that an activity ordinarily imposes serious and wrongful harm on others, but it is not rightfully outlawed. So maybe some activities do harm others, but we still don't outlaw those activities, and we wouldn't say it would be right to outlaw them. An example of this might be cars. We drive cars even though we know that it can harm others and does harm others, even in the ordinary use of cars. So this is a counterexample, and we can say that, well, maybe there are cases where it doesn't matter that it harms others, it's still okay. And maybe drugs is just like cars. Maybe drugs is one of those cases. Another counter is that drug use does not ordinarily impose wrongful harm on others. So in this argument, we might be saying that drug use mainly has harm on mainly drug use harms the user. So somebody might overdose on a drug. This will harm them. But it doesn't cause harm to others. My use of a drug, my overdosing on a drug doesn't necessarily harm anyone else. So maybe that's why I'm allowed to do it. But we could counter this by saying, well, it does seem like some drug use does in fact harm others. There's the fact that if you die, the people who care about you might be harmed by your death, for example. It also might be the case that your drug use might cause other secondary effects like secondhand smoke or the endangerment of others. But at the same time, it may be the case that some drug use may not even harm anyone, including yourself. Some drugs may be largely benign. So those drugs wouldn't count in this consideration because they would be minimally harmful or not even harmful at all. Another argument regarding drug use is the paternalism argument. It goes, most drug users are subject to a significant chance of serious harm from their drug use. The government should prohibit people from doing things that threaten a significant chance of serious harm to themselves. Therefore, the government should prohibit drug use. So in this argument, we again are arguing against drug use, specifically for prohibiting drug use, but on the grounds not of harming others, but of harming oneself. So what might be an argument against the paternalism argument? The first counter-argument might be that most drug users are not subject to a significant chance of serious harm from their drug use. This may be the case statistically. It may be that most drug use is harmless. Certain drugs, particularly, may be harmless. But other drugs may be harmful. And presumably there are some drugs that are just poisons that are extremely harmful. So this would probably depend, this counter would depend on which drug we're talking about, and it would depend empirically on how harmful that drug is. A second counter would be that the government should not prohibit people from doing things that threaten a significant chance of serious harm to themselves. So on this counter, we're just saying that the government should stay out of people's business. Whether or not I use drugs is my private affair, and I have chosen the harms that come with the drug use. so the government just shouldn't intervene. We may agree with this, that the government shouldn't intervene in certain realms of our life, even if those realms of our lives are harmful potentially. We get to choose what we want to do with our lives. But it also seems like there may be cases where we should intervene if somebody is doing harm to themselves. If somebody is under the influence and is going to drive a car, for example, it seems fairly obvious that we do consider it more okay in that case to intervene and perhaps stop them from driving so that they won't harm themselves. The next argument is the efficiency argument for legalization. It goes like this. Criminal sanctions are morally justified only if they are the most efficient, i.e., least costly and most likely to succeed, means of reducing harm. Criminal sanctions against drug use are not the most efficient means of reducing harm. Therefore, criminal sanctions against drug use are not morally justified. So in other words, we are arguing for the ability to use drugs, and we're saying that this is justified on the basis that criminal sanctions are not likely to succeed in reducing harms associated with using drugs. So those criminal sanctions, those laws against drug use, are ineffective. So what might be some counters against the efficiency argument for legalization? Well, firstly, we might say that criminal sanctions are morally justified, but they are not the most efficient. In other words, maybe some things are justified even if the effects are not very strong. Maybe the criminal sanctions only have slight effects on reducing the harms. Maybe there are other sanctions that could have greater effects, but the criminal sanctions still have some small effects, so that's justified. Another counter to this could be that criminal sanctions against drug use are the most efficient means of reducing harm. So maybe it's true that the criminal sanctions just work for their intended purpose. These considerations ultimately come down to questions about effectiveness, questions about whether or not they are effective at achieving their purpose, whether they're ineffective, whether they are causing backfire effects and actually have do more harm than good. These questions are probably going to be answered when considering the trade-offs involved in these various cases and looking at whether or not the policies actually are performing in the real world. Another argument worth consideration is the legal punishment requires immorality argument. This argument goes, actions are justifiably criminalized only if they are immoral. Drug use is not immoral, therefore drug use is not justifiably criminalized. So basically this is an argument in favor of legal drug use on the basis that drug use is not immoral. What might be a counter to this argument? Well, a first counter could be that actions are justifiably criminalized, but they are not immoral. So maybe the government can make certain things illegal, even though those things are not immoral. Maybe the government, for example, can make certain laws that restrict our freedoms, and those restrictions of freedoms are for the protection of the state, for the stability of society, for other things. But it's not immoral if we break those laws. It's just illegal. And the government can do that because the government is passing the laws. Another counter to this argument might be that drug use is immoral. Maybe self-harm is something that we consider immoral. And if we do, then we can run this counter argument if drug use is self-harm and if that self-harm is immoral. Another argument we can consider is the rights argument. It goes, if people have a moral right to do X, then punishing them from doing X is unjust. In most cases, people have a moral right to take drugs. Therefore, in most cases, punishing people for taking drugs is unjust. So this is another argument for allowing drug use, and it's based on people's right to do so. What might be a counter to the rights argument? The first counter might be that people have a moral right to do X, but punishing them for doing X is not unjust. So maybe there are some punishments that we can actually impose on people, even though what the person did is not immoral. This is counterintuitive, certainly, but we do occasionally seem to punish people in ways for things that aren't necessarily immoral. For example, we might punish somebody for a breach of etiquette. Maybe somebody does not close their mouth at the dinner table while they're eating or something like that, while they're chewing. And maybe that's a breach of etiquette. And maybe we punish them for it, for example. We chide them or something. But we don't say it's immoral to chew with your mouth open. We just say, it's bad etiquette too. So maybe there are things that we punish people for that aren't immoral, plausibly. Another counter would be that in most cases, people do not have a moral right to take drugs. So maybe we don't actually have this right that we're talking about. This presumptive right to take drugs is just not a presumptive right. Depending on how we conceive of rights, this may or may not be true. If we conceive of rights as just something that we naturally have, maybe we think we naturally have the right to put things in our body. But if we conceive of rights as what the government allows us to do, like a civil right, not a natural right, then a civil right just is defined by what the government is allowing you to do. And in that case, then you wouldn't be able to appeal to that right because the government is granting you that right. Another argument is the tobacco-alcohol argument. This argument goes, if tobacco and alcohol use should be illegal, then other recreational drug use should be illegal. Tobacco and alcohol use should be illegal, therefore other recreational drug use should be illegal. So again, here's an argument in favor of legal drug use, but this on the basis of comparisons with other drugs. What might be an argument against the tobacco-alcohol argument? The first counter might be that tobacco and alcohol use should be legal, but other recreational drug use should not be legal. So maybe tobacco and alcohol are exceptions. Maybe tobacco and alcohol aren't that bad, and other recreational drugs are bad. So those other drugs should be illegal, even though tobacco and alcohol are not. So maybe there's a difference between different drugs and how we should treat different drugs. Another counter might be that tobacco and alcohol use should not be legal. Maybe we are prohibitionists about all drugs, including tobacco and alcohol, and would bite the bullet and say, yeah, make it all illegal. Another argument is the social harm argument. This argument goes, if a law greatly reduces social harm and does not violate anyone's rights, then the law is morally justified. Laws criminalizing drug manufacture and distribution greatly reduce social harm and do not violate anyone's rights. Therefore, laws criminalizing drug manufacture and distribution are morally justified. So this argument is not against drug use, but against drug manufacture and distribution on the basis of social harm. What might be a counter to the social harm argument? Well, we might counter that a law greatly reduces social harm and does not violate anyone's rights, but the law is not morally justified. So maybe there are laws that do these things, but maybe that's not sufficient for moral justification. Maybe something else is required to make it sufficient for moral justification. Another counter would be that laws criminalizing drug manufacture and distribution do not greatly reduce social harm or violate anyone's rights. So maybe these laws actually cause extra harms, and maybe these laws do violate lots of rights. And so maybe these laws should not be on the books. Maybe that makes them bad laws on their own standards, because they're not even doing the thing that they're trying to do, which is to reduce social harm without violating rights.